civil rights leader, black nationalist fighter. Every man was born of a woman. So who is this woman who gave birth to Malcolm? Lois later, a freedom fighter too. A famous Grenadian, she come from Langdon. Lois Langdon later, must be remembered too.
Lois Marshall Barker has over 15 years of experience in education. Her expertise is in professional development and curriculum design. Her instructional practice is rooted in multicultural pedagogy. Dr. Barker works with educators exploring how to leverage technology to create multicultural learning spaces. She has presented workshops at various conferences, focused on language oppression and discrimination, authentic writing, virtual coaching, and the use of picture books in the secondary classroom. Lois currently serves on the board of the Texas Teachers of English Language Arts, where she spearheads the DREAM program, a program dedicated to recruiting and mentoring pre-service teachers of color. Last year, she co-authored and published a children's book with her daughter, Ava. Ava's Caribbean ABC serves as a nod to Caribbean history and culture in an accessible, engaging manner for all ages. I invite you to listen and reflect on Dr. Lois Marshall Barker's presentation.
Because it is through. Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Lois Marshall Barker, and I am so excited to be a part of this Heritage Day celebration. I'm sorry I can't be live, but I really do hope that this recording adds to the conversation around culture, heritage, and just moving forward as a people. And so I am going to explore decolonizing Caribbean culture and identity. The way this presentation is set up follows a kind of chunk, chew, swallow, if you will. And so the idea is that we receive some information, we think about it, we reflect on it, and then we look to see how it shows up in the world around us, because it is through that interrogation and reflection that true change can really happen. Our guiding question, right? So like, what will drive this conversation? How can disrupting linguistic discrimination foster deeper connections to culture, community, and educational spaces? So although the bulk of this presentation will should focus on language, how it shows up in culture, and its historical roots in our specific context, Grenadian culture, we will branch off into other aspects of our culture and cultural identity, because what you'll see is that they all intersect, they overlap. We can't address one without addressing several other things. And I want to point out that although this presentation explores Grenadian culture, we will branch off into other contexts. We will branch off into the larger Caribbean region, and then I will make references to my context, which is America, specifically Texas, because what you'll realize is that the root of some of our beliefs and practices stem from a very common source. So let's dive into social identities, right? So before we can talk about our cultural identity, we have to understand who we are as Grenadians, who we are as individuals. You do have personal identity. And when we say identity, it's how you show up in the world, right? When someone asks, well, who are you? What type of person are you? You start looking at the parts and pieces of yourself that represent who you are in different spaces. So your personal identity will perhaps deal with some of your personal preferences, how you refer to yourself. So I am a reader, a writer, I'm a creative. Those are personal things. This is how I personally see myself. But when we look at social identities are these markers that we make visible or invisible depending on the spaces that we're in. Social identities, that's our way of finding commonalities with others, because as human beings, we strive for community, we strive for connection, right? And so sometimes you'll see some visible components of our identities. For example, I am visibly Black, right? I am visibly female. And so those identities help me to connect with other Black individuals and in most cases, other females. There's some invisible identities that we will show or share with the world depending on the connection that we're trying to seek. Education level, sometimes social class or socioeconomic status. That's something that we have to make visible, right? As we explore these markers and who we are as individuals, we will realize that, again, depending on your context, some of those identities carry a certain power and privileges, whereas others do not. And that can change based on your context. So what might bring you power and privilege in Grenada may not bring you power and privilege in America, and vice versa. Now, with that understanding, now let's think about the major markers. When we typically say, oh, let's do some identity work, right? Share about the markers that make you who you are. These are the go-to markers. We talk about race. Even though it's a social construct, it's there. We talk about our ethnicity. We talk about nationality, right? We're proud Grenadians. We're proud Caribbean people. We're proud Black West Indian people. We talk about gender, religion, socioeconomic status or class. We talk about our abilities, and that ability can be physical ability as well as your cognitive, right? Like some of us might have learning disabilities that will look differently, and that's something we have to make visible depending on the context. We have language. Is English our first language? Is English your mother tongue? And even within the umbrella of English, you have different dialects of English, right? And so all of those differentiations matter. If you are an English speaker and it's not your first language, then you are a language learner, right? And so that's a different layer. And of course, sexual orientation. So these are the markers we tend to rely on. There are more, but these are the most common markers we tend to rely on when when we share ourselves with those around us. And when people ask us, well, tell me about yourself. How do you identify? And so I want you, and I know this is the teacher mode in me, hopefully you have some pen and paper because you're like capturing things that are impacting you, capturing things you want to ask questions about. And so I want to invite you to take some time with these and reflect on your responses. Like, how do you identify? What is your race? What is your ethnicity? What is the religion you identify with? What is your agenda, your ability? So go ahead and take a moment and work through these markers. And you can always take a picture and work on as we continue. And so when you look at your identity, right, I want you to then step away from just yourself and look at how you fit into the bigger picture. I love this wheel because it really puts a lot of things into perspective, but I really want you to think about your current context, because if I were to do this, looking at power and privilege, my identity or the identities that carry power in Grenada will not carry power here. what causes me to be marginalized in America will not cause me to be marginalized in Grenada, right? So for instance, when we look at the wheel of power, right? I'm an English speaker. My dialect may not be the mainstream American dialect, but I am an English speaker. I have post-secondary education. I have a doctorate. I am neurotypical in my thinking. I am a citizen of the United States. But even though those 4 identities give me power here, some sort of privilege, I can vote, I have access to like financial aid and those things, because if you're not a citizen, you don't have access to like financial aid for college. And so there's a certain privilege that comes with that, right? But in the grand scheme of things, in the society in which I live, the fact that I'm a Black woman, my power, like some of that power is no longer as weighty as it would be if I was a white woman. The fact that I am now a single mother, then also that lens takes away some of that power. So despite having a doctorate, despite being a citizen, despite being an English speaker, the fact that I am a Black woman in my context puts me in a marginalized group. So that power and privilege that it could get me, in most contexts, I will be marginalized. Thinking about Grenada, being Black in Grenada, that's the norm. I'm not marginalized, right? I'm not in an oppressed group, right? And so it looks differently there. If I did not speak English and I were to come to Grenada, not knowing English, then I would be marginalized because the majority of Grenadians, we speak English, right? Some of us are bilingual or trilingual with English, French, Spanish, etc. And so I might be able to find a small community depending on the language that I'm coming there with. But if I'm not an English speaker in Grenada, I am marginalized. So going back to your reflection piece, right? Think about your identities. Where are most of your identities in your context? If you are a traveler and you move between Grenada, other Caribbean countries, you move between Grenada and the United States, think about the shift, right? Think about the shift that this causes. And look at these questions. And then pay very close attention to English, that language. English is supposed to give us some power, but I want you to keep that in the back of your minds as we go through this. Where, like, is English a source of power? Being an English speaker, is it a source of power? Does it actually give us a privilege, and why? And then how does that relate to our cultural identity? So when we think about culture, the basic textbook definition of culture is the way of life of a people, right? Our religion, the food that we eat, our shared language, a system of beliefs, all that good stuff. So defining it for many years has been very basic, very accessible. But in actuality, culture can be somewhat of a complex concept. And again, we tend to define it as people, like the ways of life of a people, including our arts, our beliefs, our institutions that we pass down from generation to generation. However, culture is also learned. And so when culture is something learned, in comes our socialization institutions, right? And these institutions look like media, these institutions look like family, church, and school. So these institutions play a huge part in ensuring that a specific culture is learned. Culture is also patterned, right? And when people deviate from the norm, or they deviate from these expected patterns of belief and actions, sometimes that can be a form of resistance, and it's a good thing because you're breaking away from something that's not working for the majority of people. It's not leading to progressive thoughts. And sometimes it's seen as bad resistance, right? Like you are going against the grain, and so the majority will other you. And so it's really important that even though we have this basic definition of culture, it's important to understand that culture is fluid. Sometimes culture is stable, but it's also fluid, much like our social identities. So we looked at our identities earlier. Your identities can change based on context and experiences, and it can be the same for cultural identity, but ideally it's harder because over time these cultural identities, they have historical roots, right? So you might change, for instance, we might change our reception towards language, but then how we do that will still maintain certain historical roots. We might become more open to certain social behaviors, but then how open are we? And then we go back and it maintains certain historical roots. So with our social and personal identities, we can change. Prior to age 25, I was not a mother. That was not part of my identity. After 25, that became part of my identity. In my context of the US, one major health issue, a major surgery can move me with move my social status or my socioeconomic status, right? One major surgery, depending on your income, your type of health insurance you have, you can move from upper middle class to basic living in poverty. And that's the reality of it. And so these identities change, but culture requires a deep interrogation of historical roots. Where did this behavior, where did this system of belief come from, and why is it in existence? We talk a lot about decolonizing themes. And I get really passionate when we say decolonizing because I see it in action through lots of Native American and Indigenous peoples movements. So when you look at North America, the US, Canada, and you see their movements to demand reparations, you see movements to shut down boarding schools, you see movements to return the bodies of children murdered at these boarding schools, you see movements demanding their land back, demanding people who occupy their land to pay rents. It's a very powerful, organized movement that forces people to reckon with history, reckon with a lot of beliefs about their culture and how it has been romanticized and really distorted, right? And really reckon with how history has wronged them and what needs to be done going forward. When we talk about decolonizing Caribbean culture or Grenadian culture, we have to understand that it's more than a mindset, and we're really talking about actions that we need to take. Because sitting with decolonizing as a mindset is counterproductive. And just to understand what we mean when we say decolonizing, decolonizing forces us to decenter the narrative of colonizers, right? They have created a certain narrative for us to follow. They have designed systems to maintain a certain control over us, even though we might be an independent nation or colonizer, the British. They have designed systems that we have now accepted as culture. They've introduced beliefs and practices that we have been socialized to accept as our culture. And in order to decolonize, we have to sit back and interrogate every aspect of our cultural identity, the food that we eat, the music we listen to, the structure of our health system, the structure of our educational system, the structure of our justice system, or body of government. We have to ask ourselves as a people, all of these markers that make up culture and our way of life, where does it stem from? And how productive, how beneficial is it to us to move forward? Right, as Grenadians, right? We have to ask ourselves at the center of these beliefs and these practices, who does it benefit? Who created it and why? And if the answer is the British, and if the answer is to benefit them or to maintain some type of stronghold on us as a people from progressing to how we're supposed to progress, whether it's economically, whether it's academically, or however, then change needs to happen. Conversations need to happen, and then we need to take action. So we research, we question, and once we realize that this is colonizer-centered. This does not benefit our people. Then what must we do? What actions do we take to make sure that we shift the narrative back to what we need and who we are, separate from England? So let's reflect a little bit, right? So again, I'm getting to language, but this is a build. And so let's think about these questions. What elements of our culture are heavily influenced by the British? How have we addressed these markers? Do we accept them as our culture? Or are we interrogating them, right? So we have language from the British. Our schooling is based on the British system. We are a uniform culture. And I know our uniforms have evolved over time to bring us such joy and pride to wear school colored ties, these skirts 1 inch below the knee, socks 3 inches above the ankle, all of that. Where does that stem from and how does it benefit us? And then have we started to, decolonizing, or are we thinking about decolonizing? So now that we know what that means, where are we? Are we thinking about it, or are we moving towards taking action? And if we are in the process of decolonizing our culture, where would you like us to start? Or where should we start? Because it doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't happen overnight. Some working definitions, so for us to focus on language, because again, we're kind of like branching into language in my chunk here. And so I'm not going to read this out to you, but ideally think of language oppression as forced language acquisition. This is not a choice. This is not, I invite you to learn English, Spanish speaker. No, this is, you will speak English by any means necessary, and you will not preserve, you will not pass down your mother tongue. That in a nutshell is language acquisition, right? Language acquisition stems from racist ideologies that support the concept that there is only one proper form of that mainstream language, the language that the oppressor has deemed as acceptable, and the behaviors of language use that they say is the only way to approach that particular language. From oppression, once a language has been oppressed and we have taken on the tongue of the oppressor, then comes another layer of oppression, right? Linguistic discrimination. So this is when your patterns, your linguistic patterns, your accent, the dialect, your word choice, all of that, when you write the grammatical structures of when you write even the grammatical structures of your speech, when that does not align to that mainstream golden rule of this is proper English, or I would say the Queen, but that's not appropriate. So the King's English, right? British English. If it doesn't align to that, then you are othered. So linguistic discrimination is discrimination. When your accent, your dialect, your use of the language, your behaviors around the language does not mimic that golden rule, that the one that's superior, and others, they treat you less than, they make fun of your speech, they reject your writing, they correct your speech because your grammar is bad, they make fun of you, they make comments, they shove you to the back because we cannot have you speaking on our behalf. All of those things are linguistic discrimination. So really quickly, story time, okay? Think about the journey of English to Grenada, to the Caribbean region, right? Colonizers, at first the French, went to West Africa and they enslaved Africans. Enslaved Africans came with their own mother tongues. And then once they got to us, once they got to Grenada, so you have enslaved Africans. And I would like to believe, and research has supported this, that on the journey, right, language is a means of survival in some times. Man adheres to use language as a means of survival. So on this journey to Grenada, enslaved Africans, some speak similar tongues, some speak different tongues. They have to find a way to blend their languages together, right? To survive in this new land, to survive the brutality of this oppressor. While they get there, then they meet are indigenous people, not a lot, but a few. And sometimes in some contexts that there's a little meshing that happens, right? We have indigenous words in our language and in the names of our places. So you have that meshing. So you have West African languages meshing with indigenous language. But then the oppressor says, absolutely not. You are going to speak my mother tongue because you're going to assimilate to my culture. I own you. This is our way of life. So then you have the creation of Creole. Some people say patois. Linguist, you can battle it out. I am not a linguist. I am just a study of language and how history relates. And so just think about that Creole that is created. West African meshed with a little indigenous and French. We change hands. Colonizers change hands. Now we have the British. The British comes in and they notice this Creole, and then they're like, absolutely not. Now we are in charge, and they crush it. They begin to crush it. There's some historians that believe the British were anti-Creole because of that French influence, because you had French speakers, Creole speakers, and both. And so the British, after Fedon's rebellion, the British was very brutal. They came down really hard because prior to this rebellion, they had lost their American colony. We just had the American Revolution. So you had the American Revolution. The British are just pissed because they're losing strongholds. And so now they amp up the violence. We have to make sure that no other colony becomes inspired to try to pull what the American colonists did. And so then we have Fedon's rebellion. And so then that's another layer. They're like, absolutely not. So it became a language of rebellion. It was unfamiliar to the British. They don't know what people are saying, what information is being passed around. And so they attempt to kill the language, really and truly. And so now a stigma is attached to people who speak this Creole. And over time, the drive, it's been ingrained, it's been, you've been socialized to see this language as dangerous, to see this language as less than. And so now you must, adopt English. But in the process of adopting English, let's talk about linguistic discrimination. So now that they've basically killed Creole, Creole is basically extinct in Grenada. We have pockets, we have elders who still speak it, but it's not taught in schools. It's not recognized nationally like it is in Dominica or St. Lucia. Imagine having that West African influence on your tongue. Imagine having that, you have that, right? So that language, that how they acquire English also impacts the dialect that is created, right? So if you ever try to learn a new language, you have to get the accent right. Sometimes the pronunciation might be a little bit off. That's all part of language acquisition. But if you have a people trying to hold on to Creole and connect English, a new dialect comes up. We are not going to sound exactly like the Europeans. We're not going to sound exactly like the British, I'm sorry. And so you have dialects branching out, the accents, right? And what we have left right now is a mixture of Creole with English, kind of like how people mix Spanish and English and you have Spanglish. And most people hate Spanglish in different Spanish-speaking countries because they've othered it. In fact, indigenous languages in Mexico, in Peru, in El Salvador, they are oppressing that still to this day. Why? Because we've been socialized to believe that the colonizer's language is the proper language. Any which way, we're back to Grenadian context. And so just thinking about how that shows up in the community around you. Language is powerful, right? I love this quote from James Baldwin. Essentially, he says that language is a political instrument and a proof of power, right? It's a very crucial key to identity. It reveals private identity. Sometimes it's dangerous at times to speak certain languages, which I just kind of shared with the whole rebellion story. One may speak the same language, but in such a way that one's antecedents revealed or hidden. This is true, right? So think about England. There's a range of accents, but the minute time your English Black English, Grenadian English. Once you tap into that Grenadian dialect, what does it say about you? And he says it puts your business on the street. You have confessed your parents, your youth, your school, your salary, your self-esteem, and alas, your future. So what Baldwin is saying here is when your dialect does not adhere to mainstream, there are lots of things that people formulate about you. If your dialect is like less than, you're speaking broken English, you're not speaking proper English, you immediately assume that you're not as educated, you must be poor, and there's lots of things that happen, and there's a certain shame that comes with that. So really quickly, I'm a little bit over time. Just think about these questions. What is your experience with either concept, language oppression or linguistic discrimination, right? How do those experiences shape how you interact in your community, your professional learning communities? So for instance, in Grenville, where I'm from, Grand Broad to be specific, I could talk a certain way and I am totally fine. No one is going to correct me. No one is going to shame me. I remember as a little girl, not St. Andrew's RC, Red Cross, we had some debates. Comfortable in my community. I go somewhere in town and I can hear the other teams making fun of us when we debate because of how we speak. Oh, they country. Hear them country children, they come here, they can't speak proper English, who go understand what they're saying. And even though there was a team and we made it to the finals or whatever, despite the language, we had the knowledge, right? There's a difference in dialect, we had the knowledge. But those children, based on how we speak and based on how they're socialized to respond to people who speak like my Red Cross group, it was a very negative experience. And so just sit with that for a minute and walk through those things. How does this type of linguistic discrimination show up in our communities and across the country as a whole? Think about how you speak at home and how you speak at your job. Think about how you speak at home and how you speak at school, how you speak in your community and when you travel to another community. All of those things matter. Because imagine code switching in a predominantly Black country, right? That's a powerful thing to be in a free, predominantly Black country. So imagine having to code switch in that country. In America, and it's kind of ironic to me because I live in America, and when I speak a certain way, certain doors are immediately closed. And so then I am forced to code switch the song a certain way to get access into those doors. And I'm thinking home, you could be very open and free to speak how you speak and not have judgments. But what is the common thread? When you go back to the historical roots of a relationship with language and how it's used to oppress and how it's used to cause division, who is that common denominator? So how do we make space, right? So I conducted some informal interviews with some secondary school students, some adults, right? So the age range is like 14 to all the way to 75. I spoke with different people. I asked about the things that we read in school, and we listened to our music. So what do you see on media, the media home? What do you hear on the radio, the type of music, how do the artists speak and sing, and what text do you read and study in school, how you expect to write? And I think about my own experiences. So lucky for us, right? Lucky enough for us in our context, we have access to literature that is written with our dialects included, right? Some texts even include a little Jamaican patois. Some texts include a little Haitian Creole, depending on who the authors are. So we are privileged enough, right, to have access to literature that our children study and read and talk about and try to mimic in their writing, that really speaks to who we are as a people and speaks to our language. But then something is lost in translation when we move from this, reading it is okay, listening it in soca is okay, right? Hearing it on an interview is okay. depending on who is being interviewed and what's the context. But then having day-to-day conversations is not okay. So where does that discrimination step in? How is that learned? That is for us to move forward and move past linguistic discrimination, we have to go there. If it's okay to read those dialects in school and study those dialects, then why is it not okay to speak it? Why are we then making fun of people from different parts of the island when they speak? That's room for interrogation. Where does that stem from? Why do we choose to other people? Now, reviving Creole ties along those same lines. We have enough, we still have elders who speak Creole. There is enough literature, there are enough people to figure out exactly what are like the similarities of our Creole to Trinidad, the similarities of our Creole to St. Lucia and Dominica, right? We have enough people and research and resources to revive it, starting with having a Creole textbook. And I believe we have a few Grenadian scholars who are working and have published Grenadian Creole texts, right? So we have to really ask ourselves, what does this do? Who does this center when we revive Creole? Creole is part of who we are. We use Creole terminology all the time. Bonje, Mawet, all of those things are remnants of Grenadian Creole, but we have somehow found a way to abandon it, only use it conversationally. And then when some people use it in some context, again, we see linguistic discrimination happening. So then the conversation is, as a country, understanding where, the historical roots of English, how much are we willing to invest in reviving that part of our identity, right? Why wasn't it passed down from generation to generation to generation? We have to ask ourselves, what caused this passing to stop? Because we pass on the discrimination, but why did we pass on this whole language? Those are the questions we must seek to answer. And once we come to terms, once we reckon with that, and we realize, because the colonizer centered themselves, they wanted to squash this language in an effort to divide and maintain power, then we have to ask ourselves, is that the identity we want? Leaving out this language, is that the language we want to leave out going forward in our cultural identity? And I would hope the answer is no. I would hope the answer is that this was, quote unquote, the mother tongues of many enslaved Africans brought to the island, enslaved people who were made free. That was their mother tongue. That would be the mother tongue of many, many of our ancestors. And so with that, why is it dead? Why aren't we making space to tap into our scholars, the resources, and in countries that share the similar structure, St. Lucia, maybe Dominica, how can we network to bring Creole back? How can we revive Creole? And if we don't know where to start, we can look to St. Lucia. There are other islands doing it, reviving their lost languages or the languages that have been othered, right? People look to Haiti. Haiti speaks French and Haitian Creole, but let's not get caught up in that romance story, because Haitian Creole was also othered. Haitian Creole at one point was seen as inferior. All your legal documents are in French. In school, you're educated in French, right? So if you did not speak French, your access to things were cut off. Your access to important things, education, legal documents, your money, a lot of jobs, high-paying jobs were cut off. So it wasn't, it's like, I want to say just the other day, but when I mean just the other day, not really, but really and truly, Haitian Creole has not been level set with French in Haiti as we would like to believe. They too had their own struggles with language and how colonizer mindsets created that divide and that struggle for oppressing Haitian Creole or causing language discrimination. So again, we do have structures we can look to, but a lot of it is we have to start with self-interrogation as a community. What what the practices that we hold on to, what are the historical roots, why do we want to keep it, and what roots must we cut, what must we root out, what must we sever, right? And so again, going back to the guiding question, and some things were covered, and you're probably leaving without an answer, but that's the point of this. More reflection to lead you to an answer that works for your community. So like really disrupting the colonizer mindset, we have to interrogate, right? It might start with linguistic discrimination, that if our dialects are good enough for folk songs and good enough for soca and calypso, and it's good enough for our entertainers, it's good enough to show up in the text that our students read in class, then it's good enough for people to speak. And we have to understand that the concept of speaking proper, that is a colonial mindset. And we cannot chastise our kin because they sound differently from us. Ask yourself, why is that a matter of importance to chastise your kin? Once you realize where that behavior stems from, okay? And so again, I hope this information was quite helpful to you. This is my contact email. If you want to have this conversation further with me, you can contact me at readtechrights@gmail.com. I am happy to engage, I am happy to follow up. But I just hope that by walking through the markers of identity and understanding that decolonizing a culture, decolonizing starts with really interrogating the history of the
nationalist fighter. Every man was born of a woman. So who is this woman who gave birth to Malcolm? Louise Langdon later, a freedom fighter too. A famous Grenadian, she come from Digue. Louise Langdon later, must we remember too. As a young woman, she left Grenada, looking for greener pasture. She migrated to Canada with the spirit of Edo inside her. She became a Gabi walker, a Pan-Africanist fighter. Louise Langdon later, a freedom fighter too. A famous